As I walk down to the river to pray, wondering about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, sisters, let's go down, come on down. Oh, brothers, let's go down, down to the river to pray. This week's topic takes us to the slave plantations in America. This period, known as the Transatlantic slave trade, ended with the war, the American Civil War. Now, as you know, African-American slaves were taken, well, African-American slaves were originally African and were implanted in America starting in the 17th century and ending in the 19th century. And they invented Negro spirituals during this period and after. The one you just heard was possibly invented on a plantation, possibly just after. The first written record of it dates back to 1867, so just after the American Civil War. So it's possible it was invented just after. We don't really know. We don't know who it was written by either. Possibly collectively, because most of what came out of the slave trade was very anonymous. Slaves often didn't know their full names. They didn't know who their fathers were. They didn't even know their own date of birth. Very few slaves knew exactly when they were born. So this was generally a deliberate policy on the part of the slave traders. Slaveholders wanted to keep their slaves in a state of ignorance for the most part. There are some exceptions, of course. So I'll just draw your attention before we start on the topic, which I have yet to reveal. I'll draw your attention to this book that I've been reading. It's one of the slave narratives that came out of the slave trade. Now, slave narratives are usually the stories of escape from slavery. This is probably the best known, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. And it doesn't actually, this particular one doesn't actually tell you the story of his escape. He wrote that in another narrative. But it tells you what life was like on the slave plantations. And you get to see that it was a kind of Auschwitz that lasted for centuries. Now, in this story, Frederick Douglass tells us what it was like for him as a mixed race slave. Now, this brings us to the topic, which is colorism. Now, colorism is a form of racism. It's you could call it a subset of racism that exists both outside the African American community and within it. So you could call it also a form of internalized racism. Now, to define it, I'd say that it's a form of discrimination based on skin tone. So the lighter you are, the more privileges you have, generally speaking, in America and in Asia and in quite a few parts of the world, most notably in Latinx countries. Frederick Douglass was probably of mixed race. He was light-skinned, not deeply melanated. So he believed, as did other slaves on his plantation, that his father was actually his master. In other words, the slave trader. And as he points out in this slave narrative, he didn't actually know who his father was, but that was the case of many African Americans at the time who were, whose mothers were probably raped for the most part. The mixed race children on the slave plantations tended to be the product of rape. So, as he points out in the narrative, there was a whole new, not a subclass, but it's a whole new category of people who were biracial, what's called biracial in America. So he doesn't talk that much about colorism. It's more about the horrible beatings and lashings and murders that took place on his plantation. But being of mixed race himself, the topic is foregrounded for one of the first times in literature. I'll be having a look at two other texts at the end of this presentation, two other literary approaches to the theme of colorism. But first I'll just give you an outline of colorism since its origins. So as I said, colorism became a problem during the slave trade, on the slave plantations. It caused quite a lot of tension also between slaves, and the reason for it was actually that light-skinned slaves tended to get preferential treatment. There was a marked tendency in most plantations to put the darker skinned slaves in the fields, right, in harsh weather conditions, and they would often get lashed whiplashed more frequently, far more frequently. And the lighter skinned slaves were put in the houses, right, with the white family, where they were also slaves, but they had the function of servants, and they could get very severe treatment. Frederick Douglass points out that one of them on his plantation gets beaten to death by the mistress of the house just because she fell asleep when she was supposed to be, staying awake in case the baby started crying. So that's, let's say, more of an exception, but generally speaking, they got preferential treatment. Unless, of course, the mistress of the house was jealous of the children because she realized that they were the product of rape, and that her husband had therefore been unfaithful to her. So that, that kind of tension could have been pretty strong as well, understandably. So generally speaking, these lighter colored slaves were treated better in that they could have privileges that went as far as being taught how to read. So they were sometimes very well educated, sometimes as well educated as the white children in the house. They were sometimes given in more progressive slave houses. Then they were taught how to read, even play music, etc. And sometimes they were actually freed. So as you can imagine, because they were in the house all the time, they would have very close ties to the other children, the white children, and bonds of friendship and fondness could develop, and therefore this led to a much deeper understanding of what they were as human beings. So they were often freed, given their freedom, and some even inherited plantations and became slave holders themselves, as you see in Django Unchained. Right? That was no fiction. That there were actually African Americans who became slave owners themselves. Now, this wasn't to the liking of everyone, and in Virginia they enacted a law which assured that no African American slave could inherit, and this was called the one-drop rule. Now, the one-drop rule is this rather shocking idea that if you have even a drop of African blood in you, well, we all have African blood since we all come from Africa, but if it was known that you had a recent ascendant who was of African heritage, then you were still considered a slave, and therefore you couldn't inherit. So they made sure, well, they changed English common law. English common law held that you would adopt the status of your father. Right? Any child would adopt the status of its father. But after this Virginia law, in the colonies, the children of the master of the house, I mean, if they had any connection to slave mothers, would be linked to their mother's status. So it wasn't empowering for women at all, as you can imagine. It was just a way of keeping them enslaved, making sure that they would never, mostly never inherit, was the major argument. So this idea was called invisible blackness. The notion that you could be totally white-skinned, but have this kind of invisible blackness about you. So that was firmly stamped out after a while. But the status of light-skinned people remained higher, a good deal higher than deeply melanated slaves. So now this hierarchy remained among the slaves themselves as well. And even in the 20th century, as I pointed out in another video, you had things like paper bag tests or paper bag parties, and where you were, they held a brown paper bag like this to your face, and if you were darker than the paper bag, then you would not be let into the church, the party, the house, or whatever place it was that you were trying to get into. So now in contemporary times, paper bag parties don't exist anymore, but you still have sororities, fraternities, and societies called blue vein societies. Now, blue vein, because the idea was that your veins should be able to be visible under your skin. So if your veins were visible, then you were eligible for that particular sorority, fraternity, or society. So those still exist. And many African Americans talk about the existence of this this problem within their communities. Even within the same family, you can have many different tones of black. So even within the same family, there can be tensions, hierarchies, and a tendency to find lighter skin more beautiful, more eligible, more desirable. Outside the family, in society, there is a marked tendency to favor white-skinned African Americans or people of color who have a light skin. Their job prospects are usually better. In the 1940s, it was noted that applicants tended to put light skin on their curriculum vitae as the first and most important thing that they put on their CVs, above experience and all the rest, to make white employers feel that they could hire you, right? So it was felt that it would reassure white employers, which it did. Now, in terms of the judicial system, there have been studies that show that light-skinned African American women get 12% less prison time than African American women with darker skin. Deeply melanated people also tend to get the death sentence more easily. Now, in terms of romance, it's the same. African Americans tend to prefer women and men, but especially women who are lighter skinned. There are even dating apps where you can filter the skin tone. Now this goes, back to those parties, right? The paper bag parties. We've invented a digital version of them. So there's also a wage gap, generally speaking, between different skin tones. There's less likelihood that a darker skinned African American will be able to hold elective office, right? So get into politics. So generally they have lower economic status and diminished social prestige. You'll have noticed that most African American singers and actors who are visible in the media tend to have lighter skins. Right? I'm sure you can think of lots without my having to mention them. They also have lower marriage rates. It's statistically proven that darker skinned women don't marry as frequently as lighter skinned women. Here's an example of, this is a book on the Harlem Renaissance, and as you can see, the two couples there at the top, there's one in the corner, the man is darker skinned and the woman is lighter skinned. Now you could say, right, okay, that's just to show diversity, and probably it is. It's also for art historical reasons executed this way because men and women in art history, going back definitely to the 19th century and even in the Renaissance, artists tended to give their figures different colors, either to suggest that men and women have different essences, but mostly for the visual effect, right? Because painting is all about contrasts and making things stand out as foils, right? So that you get a more arresting image. But here it does have more political connotations, I would argue, and it really shows the preferential treatment that lighter-skinned women got, lighter-skinned men too, but it was even more important for women to be lighter-skinned if they wanted to have good marriage prospects. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you first about a work of literature that appeared in 1898 that was written by Charles W. Chesnutt. He was one of the first mixed-race African-American writers to be very popular. There were some before him, but he stands out as the first great writer who's considered African-American, even though he was of mixed race and looked rather white. So he was what was called high yellow. Alexandre Dumas' father was also depicted in Time magazine as high yellow. This was a term that's now considered offensive, but was then a term to denote someone who was of mixed heritage, but who had particularly white skin, like Alexandre Dumas. So now this short story was called The Wife of His Youth. Now, The Wife of His Youth, as I said, published in 1898, just a year before Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad was published. Now, it was published in the Atlantic Monthly magazine, which was and still is a very prestigious venue, a magazine created by the Transcendentalist poets of the 19th century. And so for an African-American to publish in this was groundbreaking. It really was a moment of glory for Charles Chesnutt. So he tells the story of a man called Mr. Ryder, who is a colorist. He favors lighter-skinned people. He belongs to a blue vein society. He's actually the head of the society, and so he's obsessed with whiteness as a form of respectability. And he's going to give a speech at this annual ball. Those blue vein societies were, for the most part, founded to organize balls at which young people could meet African Americans who were light-skinned and marry them. Right, so it was a kind of marriage market, really. And so he is going to give his speech, and he's also decided to propose to a light-skinned woman who also belongs to the society, and so it really is a kind of occasion for him. And as he's preparing this speech, as he's writing it, a dark-skinned woman comes to his door, and she's called Liza Jane, and she tells him about this man who she was in love with 25 years ago, so they discuss this, and after she's told him the story, she leaves. The next scene shows us the protagonist, Mr. Ryder, about to give his speech at the Blue Vein Society, And instead of giving his speech, he tells everyone present about a woman's story, Liza Jane's story, and he asks them the question. He says, should this man acknowledge this woman as his wife if he were to be found? And he looks first at the woman he was going to propose to, and then at everyone else, and they all concur. They all agree that yes, of course, he should acknowledge the woman, right? So it's a kind of moment that in which, even though they're all there fueled by this colorism, they all kind of break with that prejudice, and so it's a sort of humane story. And so he leaves the room, and they're all surprised, and he comes back into the large room with Liza Jane, and he says, I am the man who was married to this woman, right? She was the wife of my youth, right? So that's how the story ends. All right, so a rather strongly politicized story that takes a firm stance on colorism. Now, the last piece of literature I'll discuss is a novel called The Blacker the Berry by Wallace Thurman. Now, the blacker the berry is an expression that was used, and is still used to some extent, in the African American community. The whole saying is, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. All right, so it's this anti-colorist saying. Right, so I'll just read you a passage from it, just to give you a flavor of the text. Right, I think you'll gather just from my reading of it what the storyline is and who the heroine is. More acutely than ever before, Emma Lou began to feel that her luscious black complexion was somewhat of a liability, and that her marked color variation from the other people in her environment was a decided curse. Not that she minded being black. Being a Negro necessitated having a colored skin, but she did mind being too black. She couldn't understand why such should be the case, couldn't comprehend the cruelty of the natal attenders who had allowed her to be dipped, as it were, in indigo ink, when there were so many more pleasing colors on nature's palette. Biologically, it wasn't necessary either. Her mother was quite fair. So was her mother's mother, and her mother's brother, and her mother's brother's son. But then none of them had a black man for a father. Why had her mother married a black man? Surely there had been some more eligible brown-skinned men around? She didn't particularly desire to have a high-yeller father, but for her sake certainly some more happy medium could have been found. She wasn't the only person who regretted her darkness either. It was an acquired family characteristic, this moaning and grieving over the color of her skin. Everything possible had been done to alleviate the unhappy condition. Every suggested agent had been employed, but her skin, despite bleachings, scourgings, and powderings, had remained black, fast black, as nature had planned and effected. She should have been a boy. Then color of skin wouldn't have mattered so much, for wasn't her mother always saying that a black boy could get along, but that a black girl would never know anything but sorrow and disappointment? But she wasn't a boy. She was a girl, and color did matter. Mattered so much that she would rather have missed receiving her high school diploma then have to sit as she sat now, the only odd and conspicuous figure on the auditorium platform of the Boise High School. I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye.